Hello everyone, long time no lecture. So hopefully you've already watched the other short clips that I posted above this lecture video clip. Those are integral to your understanding. They give you a great visual of things. I imagine quite a bit of this is stuff that you have learned elsewhere, and maybe it's just reiterating some of those things, but hopefully it's also helping to clarify and further your understandings. So we're looking at cardiovascular diseases and lipid disorders. I did not ask that you list any of the learning objectives or any of the did you know points in this instance. But I do want to draw your attention to the fact that one of the did you know points, the second one, says it is more important to focus on an overall healthy dietary pattern than any one specific nutrient to reduce the risk of coronary heart disease. So two things about that point that I want to emphasize. First of all, the message there is the big picture, which is what I have attempted to convey clearly throughout the course of the semester. So people like to glom onto trends that are all about micromanagement, worrying about one particular nutrient, more supplements of this, or avoiding this. And that micromanagement kind of creates a situation where you often can't see the forest for the trees. We forget to look at the overall arcing power of everything. So it's no one thing by itself that's the problem. It's a combination of things. In other words, cardiovascular disease, disease of the heart and the blood vessels throughout the entirety of our being, is a multifactorial disease. There are multiple factors. So that big picture focus I wanted to re-emphasize, as well as the fact that in this bullet point it says coronary heart disease. Please don't lose sight of the fact that the coronary arteries are those within the heart. So when we refer to coronary heart disease, we're talking about disease of the heart. But those same vessels that run through the heart then link to other vessels, creating a system that runs through the entire body. Hence, coronary heart disease is one component of cardiovascular disease, which is a systemic or body-wide disease. So whatever is happening in the heart is impacting vessels in the legs and the toes. It's impacting the vessels that are traveling and carrying blood to the kidneys and the liver. It's impacting the vessels in the arms and in the chest and in the brain. Whatever's happening in one part of the body is happening in all parts. And so anything that has to do with our blood is a systemic disease. That's why sepsis, which was a blood infection, affects every part of the body. And the question is, what thing is going to be most impacted first to result in a problem such as death? In terms of cardiovascular disease, it's a matter of which part of the body is going to experience an acute event first. And somebody may die at that point, or they may survive and they may go on to have repeated acute events, much like the first one, such as multiple strokes or heart attacks, or they may live long enough to experience a multitude of different manifestations of cardiovascular disease. Maybe they had a stroke, now they have a heart attack, now they have kidney failure. So again, no matter what we're talking about in the body, if it has to do with the blood, then it has to do with every part of the body. And because your blood transports oxygen and nutrients to every cell in the body, then whatever is or isn't in your blood in terms of nutrition or other substances, toxic or otherwise, has an impact on every part of your being. The other thing that I wanted to point out is right here, diets rich in fruits, vegetables, and low-fat dairy products are as effective at lowering blood pressure as low-sodium diets. When used in combination, you get a double whammy. Remember, you learned that sodium is a particular mineral that is problematic in that in many people, excesses of sodium create elevated blood pressure because sodium, as you know, has a role in fluid management such that it draws fluids into the blood vessels. And when that volume in the vessel increases, there is increased pressure on the walls of the vessel, hence elevated blood pressure. You also learned in the minerals chapter that potassium has an antagonistic effect. In other words, it does the opposite. Potassium pulls fluid back into the vessels, back into the cells from the vessels and the interstitial spaces, helping to restore that homeostasis or equilibrium. So high potassium and low sodium are beneficial. Fruits, vegetables, and dairy are rich in potassium, and as long as they are not adulterated with added sodium in any form, be it a preservative form or salt, then those foods will be wise choices. Looking here at the terms, all of these are things that should be very familiar to you at this point. There are a couple terms over here that might be less so, macrophages and reverse cholesterol transport, though I believe this one was referenced in the lipids chapter. Macrophages may be new to you. Google that word very quickly if you are not sure how comfortable you are with it. I highlighted a few things here on this first page. First of all, cardiovascular disease includes all diseases associated with the heart and blood vessels, is something worth reiterating because both lay people and clinicians tend to get hung up on the part heart and they forget about everything else. So it's very important for you to understand that when atherosclerosis, the hardening of the vessels due to the buildup of plaques, is occurring in any one place, it is occurring in a multitude of other places as well. I kind of envision it like a hose, that being any vessel, that someone is dumping concrete into. And that concrete is liquid at the moment, and it's adhering to the walls of the vessels, and it is cementing itself there, right? It's becoming cement. In other words, as atherosclerosis, the formation of plaques occurs, it's irreversible. So when we add something like a stent to an artery, it's kind of like you're putting a slinky in there and you're just pushing back the plaque, but it doesn't mean that it's permanent. It's just done to open up the occluded vessel to improve blood flow. So a stent is simply meant to alleviate signs and symptoms. It is not a cure, because if you don't address the underlying drivers of the problem, which are generally uncontrolled lipid levels, then the situation will just occur again in that same place, or it's probably going to manifest in another vessel because it's already getting to that point anyway. By the time a problem occurs one place, it's primed to occur in other places as well. So you oftentimes see a series of occluded vessels and people getting multiple stents. You don't just develop one little problem and everything else is good, right? So we have to keep looking at that big picture. And again, this is why prevention trumps treatment of illness. We cannot in any way eliminate plaques. We do not have a Roto-Rooter technique that just blows them out. It can burrow through until they occlude again. We don't have medications that can eliminate plaques. It's not an option. We are treating an illness and trying to manage it, and we're unable to reverse it. With lifestyle interventions and some medications, hopefully we can prevent its progression once a disease is well established, but we can't undo the harm that it's already done. And again, this is why prevention is so vital. You learned about lipoproteins. There are others mentioned earlier in the text and in this chapter as well, but obviously our focus are on the two that are going to be monitored in any routine laboratory assessment, any serum blood draw, LDL and HDL. So you learned that LDL and HDL are basically little packages of assorted triglycerides and cholesterol that have been lumped together, and they're hitching a ride on a transport vehicle known as a protein. Remember, protein has numerous roles in the body, one of which is to act as a transport vehicle for other substances, such as lipids. So those packages, remember, are being formed in the liver because that is the central processing facility for all fat in the body. So the liver is producing that waxy sterol that is known as cholesterol or cholesterol, and then we are consuming cholesterol if we consume foods that are of animal origin. Additionally, most of the fat that's in our foods is in the form called triglycerides, which are either more or less saturated, right? And so when we consume these sterols and the triglycerides, they travel to the liver after they have undergone digestion and been absorbed into the bloodstream. And in the liver, they are repackaged into LDL or HDL packages. Additionally, some free triglycerides, if you recall, make it out into the bloodstream unbound to any proteins. That is why we looked at the image that resembles an umbrella, and we said that the cumulative total of all lipids, it should be called total lipids for the sake of ease. However, it is referred to as total cholesterol, but it is representative of a combination of those free fatty acids as well as the lipoproteins, both the HDL and the LDL, which people casually term the good and bad cholesterol. That's just a brief review to make sure you have not lost your perspective. So over here you see a key word you're going to need to acknowledge, and you're going to see that numerous studies link elevated total cholesterol and LDL with an increased risk of coronary heart disease, or for that matter, all forms of cardiovascular disease. And so for this reason, many consumers refer to LDL as the bad cholesterol, right? So you want to remember, too much of the lousy stuff is the problem. We want a lot of the healthy stuff. L, lousy, is going to indicate low density lipoproteins. H, healthy, is going to indicate high density lipoproteins. And when we talk about that standard American diet that has been referenced on a number of occasions thus far, we are talking about that diet that is high in refined grains, lots of white breads and white rice and things of that sort. We are talking about a diet that is low or not abundant in fruits and vegetables, nuts and seeds, but is high in lots of dairy foods, namely cheese and butter or meats, as well as sweets and treats. And so when we talk in terms of that standard American diet, which we know is indicative of a less than healthful approach, we can also term it an atherogenic diet because it promotes the development of plaques. So genesis is the creation of something, atherogenesis is the creation of plaques, atherosclerosis in development. So when you see the word atherogenic, hopefully it's more meaningful to you. I'm going to encourage you to look at this part right here and to think about what is happening in reference to those macrophages. If you looked that word up already, you're good to go. Otherwise, do so very quickly so that you feel comfortable with it. And be sure you take a few minutes to look through that section. So you have some great imagery here, and I tried to put some useful images on the hard copy as well. Anytime you've seen anything like this, hopefully you understood that what you are seeing here is that buildup of plaque. But let me clarify, it's not simply building up on the surface. It is embedding itself into that wall, hence why we have no way to remove it. Even the things that we can do are very invasive. You're talking about going inside of people's blood vessels within their body. Can you imagine all the risk, harm, danger involved with that? So it's certainly not an ideal intervention, nor is it without potential devastating side effects. So we cannot just casually go about trying to remove plaque from people's blood vessels. We are much better served by trying to prevent its development. Now, that being said, if you recall from the lipids chapter, our lifestyle from birth determines how quickly plaques are forming in our bodies and how much they accrue over the course of the years. And so we are all forming plaques to some degree at all times. The greater the prevalence of those plaques diffusely throughout the vasculature, as well as the intensity with which those plaques are forming, how profound they are, increases our risks immensely. But any plaque, even a minuscule one, can rupture at any time. And when it ruptures, it spills forth its contents, including blood. Tacky as the imagery is, envision a pimple bursting, because that's really what it's like. And as those contents spill forth, your body's natural response is to do what? Clot that blood, to stop that internal bleeding within that vessel. So in doing so, as those macrophages engulf that, then they solidify and they form these plaques, which can in turn rupture again. So you can potentially create a cyclical effect, or a plaque can continue to compound until such time, looking at this lower image, that it occludes the passageway entirely. It just fills in the entire tunnel there. So the more frequent occurrences within the body in terms of cardiovascular disease in its acute manifestations like heart attacks and strokes, otherwise known as myocardial infarctions and cerebrovascular accidents, are that plaques of some size are rupturing. So obviously the more minimal the plaque, the fewer the ruptures and the smaller the impact. The more diffuse and substantial the plaques, the greater the risk. Lifestyle, more than anything, impacts that. How physically active we are throughout the course of our life, the more active we are, the more elastic and pliable the vessels, and more healthy the integrity of the internal walls of the vessel, such that they are less receptive to atherogenesis. Those of us who are eating poorly from birth are going to begin to accrue plaques more quickly, and some of us have a genetic propensity such that our risk is even greater regardless of lifestyle. So that's all the more reason to be cautious with lifestyle so we don't compound the problem. So you see, biology is against some of us, but environment is hugely influential, and we should at least strive, right, to control what we can. So again, the term I mentioned at the beginning is referenced here, and you can skim through all of this to your own accord. I encourage you to take a moment to look here at the race and ethnicity box. And as we get here, targeting diet and nutrition. So remember primary and secondary prevention. So a little refresher. Primary is what we do on a community-wide level, such as public service announcements on television about not smoking or not doing drugs, or you might have seen the one that sitting is the new smoking, which is intended to promote higher levels of physical activity. When you see a board somewhere like on the side of the road, or you see any sort of posters or anything, all of that is primary intervention. Secondary intervention are the things that we do to try to assess people kind of on a community-wide level. So, for example, if you participate in one of the community health screenings on the college campus, where nursing students are asked to do things like check blood pressures or blood glucose levels, that's secondary prevention because we're looking to identify abnormalities that need to be addressed to hopefully allow for an intervention that will prevent the development of disease. And then tertiary prevention, as you recall, is when we manage an existing disease, which is what we're doing when we are trying to help people address things like diet once they have established cardiovascular disease. So I'm going to remind you that it's very important to go through these sections right here on page 476. And as we get down here, it tells us diets high in saturated, polyunsaturated, and monounsaturated fats have overall different but consistent effects on LDL and HDL cholesterol. Now, prior national guidelines for a heart-healthy diet and how we could reduce LDL focused on the unique effect of each type of fatty acid on our lipid levels in the blood and made very specific recommendations about how much we should consume in milligrams and grams. People were encouraged to limit what they consumed in the way of meat and dairy and eggs because of the cholesterol that was in those foods since they are of animal origin. And they were also told how much saturated and trans fat they should or shouldn't consume. You know these recommendations still exist to some degree because you learned about the Nutrition Facts Panel and you learned about the DRI. And you know that the dietary reference intakes, the DRI, are those recommendations. Get this much or don't get more than this amount. And we have to have some sort of a baseline on which to assess things. It's just not an exact science, right? But we continue to utilize these things to give clinicians and lay people some perspective. So while many aspects of those recommendations still hold true, it is now realized that recommendations that focused only on isolated nutrients were not the wisest approach for us to take. And you can see that right here because they did not fully encompass the many factors that relate to our overall cardiometabolic health. So really what they did was they implied, eat this, don't eat this. This is good, this is bad. And what does that do? That either causes people to feel like they're being deprived, and then they psychologically just think more about the things they shouldn't have and feel guilty when they eat them, which is not good for mental health. Or they simply throw their hands up in the air and say, there's just no way I can do this, and they embrace those foods. It's really not in line with the whole everything in moderation, right? When we have a more flexible cognitive approach to things, we think about health holistically, mentally, as well as physically, and we realize that everything doesn't have to be all or nothing, then it's easier for people to find what works for them. And so the goal now is to try to emphasize that we need to look at the big picture. And yes, somebody might be eating too much chocolate ice cream, but it's not just the chocolate ice cream we need to hound them about. We need to say, where are you in the scheme of things with sweets and treats? Because maybe it's about reducing the cumulative intake of those foods, and they can focus on which ones that they can reduce or choose to eliminate to help things line up better. So while it can be frustrating to try to help people be in a better place instead of the best place, what we know psychologically is that when we work towards improvements instead of perfection, we actually accomplish more. That black and white, all or nothing thinking doesn't work for most of us as individuals, so it's not going to be working well for the people that we aim to service either. Now, I'm going to ask that you skim through this. And let's see how long this thing takes. I don't know if mine's the only one this slow. So as you continue over here, it starts to talk about saturated fats. And as it says here, there's still a bit of debate centered on this. But that this type of debate that serves to confuse the consumer and distracts from the message that an overall healthy dietary pattern is recommended to foster cardiovascular and nutritional health, and that such patterns leave room to make varying choices. So in the past few years, there's been a whole lot of this, hey, saturated fat's not so bad, and you read these little snippets here and there. The reality of it is, yes, saturated fat is very complex, and I mentioned this earlier, but it really doesn't matter how much you know about which food's saturated fat composition is that which is more or less favorable. What really matters, once again, is the big picture. So we don't want to be doing a lot of anything that has any potential to be problematic. So coconut oil versus butter, the reality of it is we don't want to overdo anything. We don't yet know how much of any of those things are the culprit, and the reality of it is that it probably varies from person to person and how much harm it does. So if we know that too much saturated fat is harmful for quite a few people, whether that's based on their biology or not, then we know that somebody's going to get hurt. And we don't yet have a way to determine who will get hurt more or less and where the lines are. So when we err on the side of caution and we focus on broad generalizations in the big picture, it's easier to achieve those goals. I'm going to ask that you go through these 2 pages as well, the dietary patterns for heart health and the fat recommendations, and you'll see much of what I'm talking about is elaborated on. You're also introduced in this chapter once again to the details of the DASH diet. So I guess if you've already been introduced, then you're not being introduced. You are being reminded of the DASH diet, right? And remember that DASH diet is focused on high potassium to lower blood pressure and low sodium. It's also focused on the value of all of the different phytochemicals that are within whole grains, fruits, and vegetables. And so you can kind of peruse through this and you can see the pattern that's consistent with everything we've addressed in the course thus far. I told you a little bit about trans fats that are mentioned here previously. I talked about how they were being banned from the food supply. So please skim this section right here to make sure that you still possess a thorough understanding of that scenario. Remember, you're still going to encounter some trans fats because that configuration is naturally occurring within all animal foods. However, scientifically thus far, we don't think that in animal foods the trans fat configuration that exists is terribly problematic in our body. We think that the saturated fat that's there is the bigger culprit, and we're still trying to tweak all this out. It's not just a matter of plaques either. It's a matter of internal inflammation and other harmful manifestations. So when you look here, no specific recommendation exists for how many of the unsaturated fats, the MUFAs and the PUFAs, we should be consuming, right? But we know that those are the healthful fats. So you want to go back through this section here with the emphasis on the marine sources and the plant sources. These pages that I'm emphasizing, you definitely want to read them carefully. It's where you're going to find most of what you're looking for your chapter assignment. Most of it should not be new information. Once again, you already knew it before this course, you learned it earlier in this course, and you're just refining some of your knowledge at this point. We get over here to start talking about phytosterols and plant sterols. So phytosterols and stanols, rather, are derived from plants. So I wanted you to understand that, and I added a little bit to your assignment. And again, I'm going to ask that you carefully read this section as well as that about the viscous fiber over on the right-hand side. And then you get down here and you get into the added sugars. Remember, anything that's been added to something, whether it was through manufacturing or an individual's doing, if you're adding some form of sugar, whether it's honey, agave nectar, white sugar, raw sugar, it doesn't matter, then it has been added. It did not exist within a food from nature. You don't pick a piece of fruit and it contains added sugar. It contains naturally occurring sugars. We are consuming those sugars diluted within the entirety of the food and in a package that contains a multitude of other valuable nutrients as well as the water that we need. So it is those added sugars that are added to things that are the problem, and it's not just simply a matter of, oh, probably some extra calories. They are directly harming us in other ways, and you want to review the points that are made on these couple of pages in terms of what ways they are potentially harmful. These checklists are great for you to kind of assess your knowledge. I do believe that this is a worthwhile read right here, the evidence-based practice approach. It addresses the popular low-carb, high-protein. You know, depending upon the semester, that diet trend has a different name. It's had many different names over the years of my career, so I guess the latest trendy name is either going to be the paleo or the keto type approach. All right, let's see. It continues here, so I don't need to spend a lot of time on that page with you. And we're looking back once again at those omega-3 fatty acids. So remember, DHA, EPA, ALA, can you differentiate between their sources? So down here, beyond hyperlipidemia, hyper-elevated lipidemia, lipids, the presence of elevated lipids, hyperlipidemia. Although LDL cholesterol is the primary target of therapy to reduce the risk of all forms of cardiovascular disease, there are other risk factors, both traditional and emerging, where nutrition may have an impact and thus warrant discussion. And hence, I want you to read these sections here. You see this alcohol and cardiovascular disease section. We get over here and it talks about dietary supplements, which has been a hot topic all throughout the text. So you want to be aware of those things. Once you get over here to hypertension and you look at the hard copy, I give you some imagery to assist with that as well. You may or may not be aware that it was only recently, I don't know if a year is correct or if it's been 2 years, but recently, that the criteria for how we classify blood pressure has changed. So 120/80, when we say it's normal, we don't necessarily mean that everybody should be 120/80. In fact, ideal blood pressure is below that. So remember, normal doesn't mean everybody should be there. Normal is merely a baseline in terms of any means of assessment, whether it's a cholesterol level or a blood pressure or a blood glucose level. Normal is simply a baseline. It's an average that gives us some sort of a place from which, or a point of comparison rather. So 120/80. If somebody is significantly below that, there's concern. If somebody starts creeping above that consistently, then we need to see, is that a trend that is increasing upwards, or are they consistently above it, but that point at which they are above it remains unchanged? So stop and think about this for a moment. Less than 120/80, more like 115/75, indicates really good flow within the vessels. Those of us who lead a more healthful lifestyle tend to err on the lower side. I know that I do, so ironically, when I have my blood pressure checked, I actually have to say, don't freak out that it's lower, and sometimes surprisingly lower. That's my norm. And I check it frequently enough on my own that I am aware of what my norm is. Because you see, blood pressure, remember, changes constantly. The truest, and this is of great value to know, the truest blood pressure assessment is that when you awake in the morning before you so much as sit up. That is your true resting blood pressure because you have been supine for an extended period of time. The moment you sit up, your blood pressure will rise. You stand up, your blood pressure will change. When you eat, it changes your blood pressure because of digestive processes. If you smoke, it changes your blood pressure. If you walk or exercise, it changes your blood pressure. If you are stressed. So random blood pressure assessment, like at a doctor's appointment during some course of the day, is just that. It's just a random momentary assessment. So all your physician's office, if you go once a year, has to go on is how it changed since a year ago. When you stop and think about that, that's a pretty crazy way to assess things. So I routinely encourage the people that I counsel to buy a $50 blood pressure cuff. It is a worthwhile investment. And to routinely check their blood pressure. If they have no known health problems, maybe do it once a month. You can keep it right next to the bed, reach over, slip it onto your arm, pull the Velcro, and hit the little button on today's gadgets. And if somebody does that, they are able to assess their own blood pressure ongoing, and if they start to see an upward trend, then they can seek some sort of medical consultation. If someone has known elevated blood pressure, then by all means, that's the approach that they should be taking. It should probably be on either a daily or weekly basis at minimum. They need to be monitoring their trends. How are we going to know what somebody's norm truly is if we don't have a way to assess it? We can't be there when they wake up every day. So knowing your personal norm is of great value to clinicians because we can better treat you. When I used to run rescue on the ambulance, one of the first things that you do when you get there is you slap a blood pressure cuff on somebody. Well, an incredibly low or high blood pressure is going to concern me, but how do I know what the person's norm is? And oh, by the way, if they're on medications that are artificially lowering or increasing their blood pressure, that's relevant too, right? So that's your insight for this section, and I'm going to let you read the rest of that independently. Keep in mind, pre-hypertension, which you could consider one word or a hyphenated word with a prefix, is going to indicate that somebody is consistently above the quote-unquote 120/80 norm. But it is not until they get higher, consistently, repetitively, that they are diagnosed with hypertension. So one time doesn't do it. We learned a lot about sodium early on, and then later in the minerals chapter. While this is a great little reference here, this all talks in milligrams and such, and you guys learned how to assess a nutrition facts panel based on the percent of the DRI contained within one serving. You learn the 5, 10, 15, 20, because that is a much easier tool for all of us, and it's a really simplistic way to educate others. Hey, you want to look for blank percent or less of these nutrients. You want to look for a high amount of this nutrient. There's only one on the label that applies to, right? And if you can give people those simple tools, it empowers them immensely to make an educated decision. Now, it segues here into metabolic syndrome, and a syndrome is really a collection of something, right? So think about the ways that we use the word syndrome. Irritable bowel syndrome. That's not a disease. That's not an actual diagnosis. That is an indication that there are a series of abnormalities occurring. And it means we don't really know what's wrong, but something is out of whack. There's a syndrome, and it could be precipitating a pending diagnosis. It could be a sign of something developing that will manifest in a more definable diagnosis later. So I can use my own personal example here. For years, I struggled with the signs and symptoms indicative of irritable bowel syndrome. And it wasn't until about 8 years ago that things took a turn and something was clearly wrong. And I was diagnosed with a bowel disorder, an inflammatory bowel disorder, a definitive diagnosis of ulcerative colitis. And so I didn't actually just have some random disease for years. Probably what I had was the development of this more specific disease. So a syndrome is something that precedes something more serious. It's a kind of a collection of things that say, hey, this warrants some attention. Maybe you can target these individual signs and symptoms. Maybe there's something you can do comprehensively that targets them all. And if so, maybe it'll throw this train in reverse before it turns into something full-blown. And depending upon the circumstances, that's more or less possible. So metabolic syndrome says something is wrong with the metabolism of lipids is altered. The metabolisms of glucose is altered, and so on. So when somebody has blood work done for an annual physical and any of those biomarkers are off, those are metabolic abnormalities. That's what we're looking for. We're looking to see what's happening inside the body. Are the metabolic processes in the liver, in the kidneys, in the cells, in any way impaired? And if they are, then it is indicative of an underlying problem or a developing problem. So a cluster of abnormalities is going to indicate that something like cardiovascular disease or diabetes is developing. And we're going to look at diabetes later, so I don't want to get too into that, but I will say we've all heard of pre-diabetes. Well, that is metabolic syndrome. You have less often likely heard of precardiovascular disease, but as is very well explained here, that too is metabolic syndrome. So carefully study the imagery I provided you with, as well as the criteria here, and make sure that you understand this. There are some great videos online if you wish to Google, and it gives you some greater perspective. So then you get into the heart failure section, and I did provide you with a couple of clips that illustrate heart function. So you kind of have to think in terms of the fact that our anatomy is such that all blood is ejected from where? The left ventricle into the aorta, right? So that left ventricle is contracting and relaxing constantly. And if every time it contracts to squeeze that blood out of the heart, to eject it into the aorta for travel throughout the entirety of the body, working against gravity, then every time it pumps, it's going to grow more tired. Now imagine if there are obstacles throughout the tunnels of vessels. It's pushing against plaques that have built up. It's trying harder to push the blood through narrower passageways over the year. That muscle, which is what the heart is, that left ventricle, is going to become more and more stretched out. I tend to envision somebody bouncing a basketball, if it could be done, for days on end. And imagine how eventually it's losing air with every impact with the ground, and it becomes less well inflated and is thump, thump, to where it won't bounce anymore. As that left ventricle is more and more stretched out or enlarged from overworking itself, then it cannot pump blood as effectively. Left ventricular hypertrophy, enlarged left ventricle, generally results in heart failure. So people with high blood pressure may have high blood pressure due to the presence of plaques. By the same token, the presence of plaques worsens high blood pressure. Think about that. So people with high blood pressure are going to develop other forms of cardiovascular disease, including a multitude of different types of heart disease, such as heart failure. Specifically, when the blood is backing up into the heart, it's becoming very congested. It can't be forced out. There's not enough oomph. And so it's congested, and the fluid is pushing back from the heart into the lungs, and people are feeling like they can't breathe, and they're coughing a lot. That's your congestive heart failure. Think about this too. If the heart can't pump that blood due to heart failure, then the nutrients and the oxygen won't be delivered to the cells, and they won't get what they need to thrive. So other parts of the body will suffer, including the brain. If it can't get oxygen, a person can't think clearly. So our folks with congestive heart failure are going to have what appears to be dementia. They're going to seem very confused. All of it makes sense if you stop and think about it. So I'm going to encourage you to read carefully. This is a really great textbook. Hopefully you feel like you're getting a lot out of this book. It's one of the better ones I've seen. So it talks about that fluid and sodium retention that you need to be familiar with here. Hence why many times you will see your patients being put on fluid restrictions. And then cardiac cachexia comes up, and I'm going to let you educate yourself on that independently. And again, as always, as you get to this last section, I always encourage people to look at the summary at the end of any chapter in a textbook and to assess their own knowledge. So as you look at these points here, you hopefully are asking yourself, yeah, did I know that? And you're going, yeah, I knew that, I got that. If not, you should write down any of these points, and you should stop now and ask yourself, why do I not get that? Why does that not make sense to me? If I am asking you questions on the exam, I'm asking you questions that draw on your collective knowledge at this point. So these bullet points hopefully are pulling that together for you, and you're feeling confident about that. All right, I'm going to leave you on that note.